Hi, I'm Megan Ann Wilson, aka She Got Game, and this is my multiple sclerosis diagnosis story. Now, I wanted to make this video because MS is one of those diseases where it looks different on everyone. You can have no visible disability. You could maybe need a cane or a walker. You could only have one or two symptoms, or you could have symptoms for years and not realize it and just brush it off as something else. I think everyone's story, is unique and is important. But as someone that had the disease kind of come up seemingly out of nowhere, and it definitely wasn't, it was definitely exacerbated by certain life events. But I think it's important to kind of talk through it and explain what it was like for someone who was kind of taken by surprise. Now, I know there's quite a few people from reading, the MS Reddit and things like that, where they've been trying to get a diagnosis for a few months, some people a few years. For me, it really only took about a week for my initial diagnosis, and then to get my kind of confirmed diagnosis about 2-3 weeks. To put it in perspective, I started having noticeable physical symptoms in mid-May. I was hospitalized at the end of May over Memorial Day here in the United States, and I got a kind of like a primary diagnosis on my follow-up appointment in the beginning of June, and by mid-June, I had my official diagnosis. Although the two neurologists I saw kind of have a differing opinion, they both agree that it's a form of MS. Also, I want to make sure it's clear, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a specialist, I'm not a neurologist. I'm a self-employed person who recently, turned 40 and has been looking at pivoting my career and trying to reduce my stress. And as I was trying to do that and take care of myself, I got MS. So it wasn't completely shocking, but it was shocking in the sense that I thought I was doing everything to take care of myself. I thought I was being really careful. I thought I did everything to be healthy. And I think there was a lot of frustration for me, not dissimilar to how I felt when I got diagnosed with ADHD. Like, it was affirming to have a diagnosis, but also frustrating. This is obviously different because I was like, oh, I've stressed myself out so much, I gave myself MS. And that's not necessarily true, but that's how I felt. This is all just to say I'm sharing my story to maybe make things easier, to have another opinion, and also just to show how different this disease can be from person to person. It's very much an individual disease. We have a lot in common, but very rarely do people have the exact same symptoms, the exact same timeline. It can change to person, but there are enough similarities that there's a lot of power in sharing your stories and see what people do to make things easier, to deal with it, to laugh about it, to commiserate. So to go back to the timeline, this is around May 15th, 14th, somewhere around there. I remember I was on a Zoom call with my family, and last couple of days I had started feeling numb, and it was mostly on my left side. So it was basically in my face, but especially around my mouth, sort of like temples down, in my chest, right around to like right underneath my breasts, and sort of in my stomach, but not really, and my arms. So I in my hands, and it kind of felt like, when your arm falls asleep because maybe you're sitting on it or you're just kind of angled the wrong way and it's all pins and needles. It felt like that all the time. And it would go from where it was almost tingly hot to tingly cold to just feeling numb and kind of like a frostbite throughout the last couple of days. And I remember being in a call with my parents and being like, this is weird. And by Saturday morning, and I had these symptoms for a few days, I thought originally, because I had a hernia in my cervical spine, like right underneath my like basically right around my neck and my shoulders, from overwork and from working out and stress, that I thought maybe that was back, and it was just maybe more serious, because I did have numbness in the past, but it wasn't as serious before. It was intermittent, but this was different, that it was constant. At that point, I was a little bit dizzy and tired, but I thought, quite honestly, my nervous system was just shot, and it was. But I thought I was just, it was a really stressful year. I finally had some money come in from a client that was delinquent. I had a roommate that had just moved out. So it was just kind of like, it was a big transitional period. And I was kind of figuring out, what am I going to do next for my business? Do I need to pivot? There was a lot going on in personal and professional matters. By Saturday, I had told one of my friends, and she suggested I go to urgent care. So I went to one in our neighborhood, and the doctor almost right away suggested it could be linked to a disease I had back in 2017. So I had parahypothyroidism in 2017 when I did a reality show in Portland. I had fainted. I had the left side tingling. They thought it was a stroke. Turned out I had these tumors that were causing too much calcium on my parathyroid. Usually it comes from stress. Usually it happens in your 60s. I was in my early 30s, so that was like a big shock. And eventually I had surgery. I was still living in Toronto and thankfully had, good health care. So when I went back after the show, I had them taken out. And when I woke up, it was like I was a whole new person again. I didn't realize, I was so foggy. I was so tired. I was run down. I didn't know what to do. A lot of the feelings that I was feeling at that moment in the doctor's office in 2025 in Brooklyn. So the doctor ran some blood work. They did an EKG because I was having symptoms that I thought were related to my heart. I now know them as something they called MS hug, which honestly is a total misnomer because it hurts like hell, at least for me. It's like getting stabbed by a python that's squeezing you in varying, degrees, and it's right around your heart. On either side. Like for women, it's pretty much right below where your bra is if you wear one. So I was dealing with that. So they want to make sure it wasn't a heart condition because it can run in my family. They suggested that maybe I had the inverse, where now I had, instead of having too much calcium, I had too little and to take calcium pills. And I didn't feel like it was that. If anything, I thought maybe I had too much because it felt somewhat similar to how I felt in Portland. Over the next 2 days, I was very dizzy. I was also, in general, going through a pretty bad depression. I realize now that was linked to the MS as the, psychiatric symptoms, emotional, mental stuff can be really linked to MS, whether it's brain fog, fatigue, depression, those sort of things. I also noticed my tremor that I've always kind of had a bit, but it was worse. And I was getting more numbness, more heaviness. And I was starting to get to the point where I would feel really dizzy and kind of fall over. I would look up and I would feel like I was seeing like a bright flash, and it made it difficult for me to walk my dog around. And I was starting to feel like my mouth was kind of like moving without me. I felt like I had some sort of tic. So by Monday, I called my primary doctor's office. I couldn't get in to see her, but I got in to see an NP. And we did more tests. And she basically told me while I was there, my EKG was great. They're going to do even more blood work, but there's a good chance it's neurological. She didn't say, hey, I think this is a huge problem. You definitely have MS. She was more trying to tell me that if nothing comes up, that's where we're leaning towards. She didn't think because of the other markers I had that it was likely the stress disease again, that parahypothyroidism, the hypercalcemia, but we did the blood work to be safe. And so by Wednesday morning, I got all the blood work back from her. I still hadn't got it from the urgent care. And she said, okay, I put in a referral for a neurologist. She's like, but if you get even a little bit worse, I want you to go to the ER. And when I was coming back from my doctor, usually it takes me anywhere from like say 7 to 10 minutes to walk to one of the subway stops. It took me about 30 minutes. I was so tired. I just have never felt such a wave of fatigue that wasn't associated with like going out too much or being sick, So by Wednesday, Knicks were in the playoffs. I was going to go into the hospital. It was raining really hard and I couldn't decide if I should. So I waited another day and it kept getting worse. It kept getting more numb. I kept falling over. I didn't know what was happening. I was tired, but I couldn't really sleep. So I did a virtual visit from NYU hospitals and I had a doctor there and he was very kind and not dismissive, which I will say pretty much every doctor and nurse I've dealt with in this whole time frame no one has like gaslit me, made me feel like my symptoms are invalid, anything like that. So I feel really lucky. And he said to me, you know what? I'm not saying you have MS, but I think you should go to the ER just to be safe. So he called ahead to their two main hospitals. There's one Sunset Park and one in the city. And a friend of mine who would initially help, tell me to go to the doctor said, I'll drive you. So we went Thursday evening, I think probably around 10 o'clock. And one of my other friends offered to stay. I was like, let me just go and like get the blood work done. And if it gets more serious, I'll call you. Thankfully, because, the doctor who I had seen in the virtual visit called ahead, I didn't have to wait. I went straight in. I was getting, all my vitals checked within 5 minutes. I was in a hospital room in the ER in 10 minutes. And I saw a doctor within 15. And she did a pretty extensive workup and checked everything out. We did all these tests and the nurses were like, oh, we're just going to do a lot, and I was like, oh, it's fine, whatever you need. And they gave me things for, like migraines, because some of the symptoms I was having could be related to that. Could be like a severe migraine, could be other things. We did CAT scans. I saw my first, batch of neurologists around like 1 a.m, and it wasn't making my symptoms any better, but I was feeling a little bit of a relief from, because at that point I started having a pretty bad headache and I started to feel more numb and more heavy. And so the doctor came around, I want to say around 3 or 4 in the morning, and she said, listen, we really need you to have, a full MRI to make sure we know what's going on, because I am right in the range of when people get diagnosed with things like MS or Lyme or anything similar. So, she's like, you could go home or you could just wait till 7 in the morning. We'll do it here. I said, sure. So like about 7:01 in the morning, I went and got an MRI for my head and my spine with contrast. It was like an hour. It was not fun. Kept getting fluids, more blood work, constantly checking stuff. And I met with the attending neurologist, who I found out later runs their MS Institute. They said it was MS because where I had brain lesions, which is sort of like saying like inflamed brain holes, is indicative usually of MS, and they had to do a spinal tap. So at that point I was like super overwhelmed. I just started like crying. I mean, I've been in the ER. By the time we talked, it was probably like 11 in the morning. And so we talked about, how that would happen, what we would have to do. And then a friend of mine was able to come and stay with me, which I really appreciated it, because it was like, okay, they're going to stick this giant needle in my spine. Thankfully, I don't have a fear of any of that stuff, and I didn't have to see it happening, so that was great. They took me to a separate trauma room because it was Friday afternoon. Thankfully, it was quiet, and what was harder than the actual spinal tap was lying down for about an hour straight after while I was getting more drugs. Once that was done, they, sent that out to be analyzed both here, and I think they had to send it to like the Mayo Clinic as well. And by about 7 o'clock, I had my next nurse, and she said, okay, we're going to give you all these steroids, and that's usually how they treat this kind of inflammation. So they hooked me up with a heavy bag. We had basketball on. My friend was still with me. And then finally by about 11:30, we were done everything. It definitely took a bit longer because, it's the ER. It's not a dedicated neurology area. So that's to be expected. But I think we probably were in our car ride home by about 11:30, 12. My friend who lives in my building was able to watch my dog. We ordered and ran in and got Indian food on our way back. We ate a bit. And then I just kind of passed out. I think I slept about 3 or 4 hours, and I felt better. I felt like my brain was working again. And I use this adage of was like, I didn't realize how much I didn't recognize myself until I started feeling better. Started feeling like I could form things again. I was still sore. I still kind of felt not great, but I felt better than I had before I went to the hospital. I made the mistake on the Saturday of reading too many Reddit pages and too much info about MS, and I read all the worst case scenarios, and I kind of had to crash out. I'm not going to lie. So Saturday was rough, but at least, I was feeling better. And they had told me at the hospital I would be going to an MS clinic within a couple weeks, and we'll talk about it. Cool. But they didn't give me drugs to go home with. They did say things like caffeine, yoga, meditation, working from home, all things I do. Like I said, I'm generally healthy. So I was like, okay, we're in a decent space for me to tackle this disease. And then Sunday I was talking with one of my friends from back in Canada, and some other people were checking in, and my old roommate came, and we put up one of my blinds so I could make sure I could get my room nice and dark. And then I just had a really quick descent where it became like someone was sitting on top of my head, crushing my spine, and I couldn't talk anymore. It felt like my mouth was going to close and never open again, and that was something that was really scary to me. But yeah, it felt like my neck was compressing. I was shaking. I started having to write down all my symptoms because I'm like, am I going to be able to talk? What's going to happen? And so I called my neighbor, and we went to the hospital, and thankfully she agreed to watch my dog. And so we go in, and thankfully once they, pulled up my record, realized I had just been there, they brought me right in. I was shaking so much they couldn't really take any of my vitals. By the time we got there, I was really having a problem walking. I was really losing any power in my left side, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't having a stroke. So they ran me through a stroke road. It was like being in the pit or another, like hospital drama. It was really crazy to kind of have this like bird's eye. It felt like I had a bird's eye view of how it all happens, but it was happening to me. So they ran it through really quick, and within an hour, I was in neurology and I was getting admitted. I got there on the Sunday, and I left the Tuesday by around noon or 1. So I stayed there for 2 nights. And yeah, they gave me steroids pretty much as soon as I got there on a IV. Started to feel better from that. I didn't have a great time sleeping because, there's all this electrodes on you and you're moving, and it's very distracting to have it all over you. So I talked to some of the neurologists who came in. One was specifically an optical neurologist, which was great because as someone who works in fashion, vision is such a huge part of what I do. I was so worried about, having optic neuritis, which is a symptom of MS. And that was something that I was obviously worried about. I learned that this feeling I was having wasn't that I was having a heart attack, and when the machines went off, it's because they slipped. It's because I had this MS symptoms, MS hug. So, while I was there, they checked on me regularly. I got to order all these amazing meals. And when you're on steroids, you have to get your glucose checked because it spikes that. And my friend was able to bring in, some stuff, and some people called and checked in, and that was nice to have some distractions, but not, too much. IV steroids on Monday and Tuesday as well. And then they gave me a bunch to take, or basically they filled a prescription for me to slowly taper down. And I was told that I would have a follow-up virtually the next week with the attending neurologist. And then I'd have a dedicated doctor from the MS clinic at NYU the week after that. The app was really, and they had an iPad, they had everything, so I could keep track of all my test results. I could read everything. They checked in a lot, so I felt really cared for. But obviously, it's just hard to sleep with all that noise. And then they also gave me gabapentin and muscle relaxer to deal with the symptoms I was having and the pain. And then obviously some of the symptoms would be related to the steroids. Thankfully, we took some time when I was leaving, and they went through everything. And the nurse was like, hey, let's get them back and make sure we get you all the meds you need, and we'll check. They were checking coupons on GoodRx. Everything was great. And then some friends that are like family picked me up on the Tuesday morning and drove me back. And by the time we got back to my house, my other friend that was walking my dog, she came back with my dog. And my local pharmacy delivered my first round of pills. So I felt very taken care of when my mom arrived that night. And I would say, the first day I could walk the block to my pharmacy and back. The next day I could walk around the block. Then I could walk to the park. Then I could walk to the second park. So little by little, I started to feel better. And with the steroids, it definitely felt like I looked like a Wii character. It felt like my head was floating, and my insides were electric and shaking. And I got an app and was starting to record all my symptoms so I could see if I could track it, and also just to remember all the pills I had to take, because a lot of the supplements they recommend I already take, like vitamin D, magnesium, CoQ10, things like that. And then also, being that I am on ADHD medication, they often prescribe that to people with MS because their fatigue is so strong. The joke was I was just going to have regular people energy because I'm more of a Energizer bunny most of the time. And then when we had the follow-up, my mom joined for the virtual visit. The attending neurologist, who isn't my kind of daily neurologist, but obviously she oversees everything, thought it was early RRMS, which is the relapse remitting. Thankfully, I only have 2 lesions. Some people, by the time they get checked out, have 20 or 50 or 100. But obviously, it matters how big they are, how severe it is in time. So these were still active and inflamed. So they don't think I've had MS for years. They think it was likely lining up with all the stressful things I was going through that were especially stressful, I would say, from February to May. And so that lines up in terms of this sort of 3 months period of when it all occurs, because usually if they're white and inflamed, it's usually within 3 months. So that would make a lot of sense for my timeline. So we went through which disease modifying therapies, which are also called DMTs, which I would take and what I would have to do. When she told me, the neurologist, when I was in the hospital, I was like, oh my God, I'm not gonna be able to hike. I'm not gonna be able to do my yoga certification. I'm not going to be active. I live alone. I have a dog. What's going to happen? And they were all very much no, our goal is for you to be as self-sufficient as possible, to be as active as possible. And that's some ways that, the more active you are when you get diagnosed, the more likely you are to be able to not necessarily fight it off, but be better equipped to deal with it. And so they also gave me a referral to do physical therapy because of my previous problems, in my neck and my shoulders. That's really what tensed up. It got to a point before I went to the hospital as well. I forgot to mention this, where my neck was so stiff I couldn't turn my head. I couldn't even do a cat-cow stretch. And when I was in the hospital, once I got admitted, it was like that even when I was leaving. So thankfully, doing stretches, taking the muscle relaxers and the GABA, and as the inflammation started to go down because of the steroids, I could move it again. But that's something I have to, continuously keep up with probably. And it's not a bad idea considering I'm 40 now. We met the next week with my neurologist at the MS clinic here in Brooklyn, and he was great. My mom came, and my mom was able to ask a lot of the questions that maybe I had forgotten. We both had our notebook. We both wanted to be on a high efficacy DMT. I went in probably wanting to be in Kesimpta or maybe Mavenclad. My mom was more pushing for Mavenclad, but because I wouldn't be able to try to have children for 2 years, And the other drugs, like let's say Kesimpta, Ocrevus, Briumvi, you can maybe wait a couple months instead. And because I'm not 100% sure about kids, that was something that I wanted to keep an open mind about. But I can do a separate video about why I chose Kesimpta too. And now he thinks I have something called CIS, not RRMS, which is basically the closest analogy I could find is like if you have HIV, there's a good chance you'll develop AIDS. But just because you have HIV doesn't for sure mean it. But I do have a lot of the markers, which looks like it will progress there. But because we found it so early and likely during the first relapse, there's a good chance we can stay in this sort of CIS bubble before clinically isolated syndrome is what it stands for, can have this MS relapse, but then you don't have it ever again. So ideally that would be great because these symptoms I've had aren't great, but they're more manageable than say losing my vision, right? Or losing my mobility completely, which I know a lot of people have had to deal with and they're doing okay, now, but that was definitely some of the things that I was most concerned about going forward. MS is not my identity. It's just like part of what I live with, right? So I think that was something that was an important decision in terms of which DMT and how to treat the disease going forward. So I started doing physio. I got as many vaccines as possible, like Gardasil and shingles, because some people who take Kesimpta and other DMTs are more at risk because you're immunocompromised for getting shingles, and I don't want to have to deal with both. I'd rather just get a shot. I saw a fertility doctor just to talk about my options there. What was hardest for me was just letting go of any guilt of like, oh, I gave myself this disease. Like I have pretty much every marker that I could develop purely because I'm white. I'm in the 20 to 40 age range. I'm from a northern country, Canada. My family's from France and Scotland, northern countries. Like it's much more common from people who, have family in the Alps and in the UK. And Canada has quite a few people with MS. So it's not really surprising. The only thing is that I don't smoke, and smoking is, one of the worst things for MS. So that's not something I'm planning to start either. But yeah, that's how it all kind of came together. It's something that I'm still learning. And I think, the plan will be keep getting my vaccines. I'll be on my second month of Kesimpta, keep seeing my neurologist. And the plan, from my understanding, we did another MRI just to make sure it wasn't like a brain bleed or anything like that. I forgot to mention it just as a follow-up. But because one of the lesions is in an MS area and the other isn't, that's why my primary neurologist is thinking it might be CIS. But, I just have to treat it just part of my daily life and keep trying to be healthy and not look at it like I did it to myself, but also understanding all this content that to me ends up reading toxic, where people are like, well, if you take care of yourself and you eat healthy and you do all these things, your body will reward you, or your body might attack you. That's just part of how it is. And I think you kind of go through a process where you're mourning your life without MS and you wonder, what's it going to be like going forward? Like some days I feel great. I feel like I hesitate to even say like myself, because this is like myself is going to change every day and it's evolving, but felt like I was before, and maybe I had MS in the sense like my brain is working fine. So I can still have those days even if I am having a few symptoms. So it's just learning to work with the ebbs and flows of how my brain works, which honestly I already kind of did with ADHD. So now it's a different version. And I think that's also why I want to talk about it, because I want to destigmatize the idea that, I'm going to do everything I can to be a good friend, sister, daughter, freelancer, contractor, pet owner. I can, and I'm not going to look at MS as an excuse. How can I set myself up so I don't have to make excuses, so I'm best prepared on how to work and deal with it going forward? If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm on Instagram and Twitter or X and Threads under She Got Game, and on TikTok I'm She Got Game 85. So I'm going to try to keep posting more. Obviously, some of the other stuff that I cover is mostly at the sports and fashion intersection. So I'll probably be covering more of that as well. But this is just, part of the full facet of life. And when I thought I wasn't going to be able to speak again on the way to the hospital for a second time, I definitely made myself a deal. Like, you have to get back to writing. You have to get back to speaking. You have to get back to sharing, because that is part of, who I am. And I don't want that to let a disease take it away from me, because that's so rude. Anyways, thanks for watching.